My parents brought out a thick, black leather-bound binder and placed it in the center of the dining table right next to my mom's signature roast chicken. I was 27, working 60 hours a week as an operations analyst for an industrial logistics firm in Ohio, and I had driven 3 hours back to my hometown of Canton for what I thought was a casual Sunday dinner. I just bought my first home, a modest two-bedroom fixer-upper that ate up every penny of my savings, and I was feeling a rare sense of pride. But as soon as my dad unzipped that binder, the warmth in the room vanished. My dad, David, clear-cut and practical his whole life, leaned across the table with a spreadsheet printout. He didn't ask how my house was coming along. He didn't ask about my job. Instead, he slid a piece of paper across the placemat toward me. At the top, in bold numbers, was a total calculation, $342,000. I stared at the paper, then up at my mother, Susan, who was smiling with an eerie, practiced serenity. My dad tapped the paper with his index finger and said, "Julian, we've done the math. Between what we spent raising you, the cost of your state college tuition that we helped cover, and the lost investment opportunities over 22 years, this is what it took to launch you. We are retiring next May. We've decided to sell this house, buy a condo in South Carolina, and you will be covering our monthly living expense baseline of $3,200 a month for the next 20 years. Consider it paying back your equity." I genuinely thought it was a joke. I looked at my younger sister Chloe, who was 24 and sitting across from me, scrolling through her phone without batting an eye. She didn't look surprised because she already knew. I laughed, waiting for my dad to break character, but his expression stayed as flat and hard as a granite countertop. When I realized he was dead serious, a cold pit formed in my stomach. I asked him where on earth he got those numbers and how he could possibly expect a 27-year-old making $68,000 a year to hand over $3,200 a month. My mortgage alone was $1,100. My mom reached over, covering my hand with hers, but her grip was tight, almost aggressive. She told me that family is an investment pool. She said they had sacrificed their prime earning years to make sure I had a stable start, and now that I was established, it was my legal and moral duty to fund their golden years. When I pointed out that Chloe wasn't being asked to pay a single cent, my dad brushed it off immediately. He said Chloe was pursuing her artistic career in Chicago. She was a woman who needed a safety net, and I was the man of the family now. He said I was earning good money, and if I tightened my belt, stopped eating out, and maybe took on a weekend consulting gig, $3,200 a month was completely doable. I withdrew my hand from under my mother's and stood up from the table. I told them straight out that I would not be paying for their retirement, that I had my own mortgage, my own future, and that college was a gift they had offered, not a high-interest loan I had signed for. The atmosphere in the house turned instantly hostile. My dad stood up too, his face turning a blotchy red, accusing me of being an ungrateful, selfish leech who sucked them dry and was now abandoning them to rot in poverty. Chloe finally looked up from her phone, sneering at me, calling me a terrible brother for leaving our parents in a bind. I walked out of that house that night with the sound of my father shouting after me, telling me I wasn't welcome back until I came to my senses with a signed agreement. On the 3-hour drive back home, my phone buzzed continuously with text messages from my parents and sister, alternating between emotional blackmail and furious demands. But that Sunday dinner was only the opening salvo. I had no idea how far my family was willing to go to force me into bankrolling their lives. Over the next 2 weeks, the pressure didn't stop, it amplified. My mother began calling my relatives, uncles, aunts, even my 82-year-old grandmother, Nana Evelyn, telling them a warped version of the story. According to her narrative, I had made millions in logistics, bought a luxury mansion, and was actively refusing to help my aging sick parents pay for basic medical care and housing. My phone started blowing up with angry messages from family members I hadn't spoken to in years. My Uncle Mark left a voicemail calling me an arrogant bastard who forgot where he came from, telling me that family always comes first no matter what. I tried to explain the reality to Nana Evelyn when she called me on a Tuesday afternoon. I told her the truth, that Mom and Dad wanted $3,200 a month, more than half my take-home pay, so they could buy a oceanfront retirement condo in Hilton Head while I struggled to pay off a fixer-upper in Canton. Nana Evelyn listened quietly, her voice frail, but she sighed and said that while $3,200 sounded like a lot, my parents had sacrificed a lot for me, and I shouldn't let money destroy our bloodline. It became crystal clear that logic was useless against the narrative my parents had carefully constructed. Things took a sinister turn when my dad decided to bypass me entirely. He knew where I worked because he had helped me move into my apartment near the corporate campus 2 years prior. On a Thursday morning, while I was in the middle of a quarterly logistics review with my regional manager, my administrative assistant knocked on the glass office door with a look of pure panic on her face. She told me there was a man in the lobby shouting that he was my father and demanding to speak to the head of human resources. My heart plummeted into my throat. I excused myself from the meeting and rushed down to the main lobby. There was my father, wearing a faded navy suit, holding that same black leather binder in his hand, yelling at the security guard. He was loudly announcing to everyone in the lobby, co-workers, visitors, vendors, that our company paid its employees enough money to abandon their elderly parents, and that he was there to request a direct payroll deduction from my salary to fulfill my family obligations. I grabbed my dad by the arm and forced him outside into the courtyard. I was shaking with anger and humiliation. I asked him if he had completely lost his mind, coming to my workplace and making a public spectacle. He looked me dead in the eye, completely devoid of shame, and said that if I wouldn't honor my obligations privately, he would make sure my company knew what kind of sociopath they had on their payroll. He claimed he had spoken to a lawyer who told him that children could be held liable for parental support under old state filial responsibility laws, and he was prepared to garnish my wages through my employer. I stood there on the pavement outside my office building, looking at this man who had raised me, realizing he was no longer acting like a father. He was acting like an aggressive debt collector who viewed me as a line item on a ledger. I told him right then and there that if he ever set foot on my company's property again, I would have security call the police and file a restraining order. He scoffed, told me I was bluffing, and walked away toward his car, leaving me standing in the cold, horrified at how fast my life was unraveling. When I got back to my desk, my manager called me into his office. He was understanding, but he was firm. He told me that personal drama could not bleed into the workplace, especially when clients were present in the lobby, and that I needed to get my family situation under control immediately. I left work that day feeling utterly isolated, realized that my parents weren't going to back down until they had stripped me of everything, my money, my reputation, and my peace of mind. Determined to protect myself, I decided to consult a family law attorney the following Monday. I met with a lawyer named Richard Vance, who had 30 years of experience handling domestic disputes and financial litigation in Ohio. I brought everything with me, my financial records, my mortgage documents, and the text messages my parents and father had sent me, along with a copy of the breakdown my dad had slid across the table during that horrific Sunday dinner. Richard reviewed the documents, taking off his reading glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. He explained that while Ohio did have a filial support statute on the books, it was rarely enforced and typically only applied in extreme cases where elderly parents were completely destitute and unable to care for themselves, not when they were trying to liquidate their suburban home to buy an expensive vacation condo in South Carolina. However, Richard pointed out something in my parents' financial demands that immediately raised a red flag for him. He looked closely at the $342,000 calculation my dad had created. He asked me about the college tuition portion, the $80,000 my parents claimed they had spent on my degree at Ohio State. I explained that my parents had always told me they used a private savings fund they had set up when I was born, supplemented by a modest contribution from my late grandfather Arthur, who had passed away when I was 16. Richard paused, looking at me intently. He asked if my grandfather had left a formal will or a trust when he passed. I told him I wasn't sure about the specifics. I was just a teenager at the time, and my parents had handled all the estate affairs after Grandpa Arthur died. They had told me and Chloe that Grandpa had left a small amount of cash to cover funeral costs and minor repairs on his house, but not much else. Richard leaned back in his leather chair and tapped his pen on the desk. He told me that given the aggressive nature of my parents' demands, it would be wise to perform a full legal audit of my grandfather's estate records, which were public documents filed in the county probate court where my grandfather had lived. He suggested we pull the probate file just to ensure there were no lingering financial ties or misrepresentations that my parents could leverage against me. I authorized Richard to look into it, paying a retainer fee that tore another chunk out of my shrinking bank account. Over the next week, the harassment from my parents reached an absolute fever pitch. They started sending Chloe to my house in Canton. She showed up on my porch late one evening, pounding on the front door until the neighborhood dog started barking. When I opened the door, she shoved her way inside, screaming at me for ruining Mom and Dad's dream of retiring near the beach. She told me that Dad had already put a down payment on the Hilton Head condo using money he had borrowed from a hard money lender, fully expecting my $3,200 monthly payment to cover the mortgage and interest starting the following month. She dropped a bomb on me. If I didn't start paying by the 1st of next month, Dad was going to default on the loan, lose his deposit, and face severe financial penalties. They had backed themselves into a corner, banking entirely on the assumption that they could bully me into compliance. I stood in my own living room, looking at my sister, realizing how deeply infected she was by our parents' entitlement. She sat on my unfinished sofa, demanding that I sign a promissory note right then and there. When I refused, she grabbed the ceramic lamp off my side table and smashed it onto the hardwood floor, shouting that I was a selfish monster who deserved to rot alone. I had to physically guide her out the front door and lock it behind her, my hands shaking so violently I couldn't even key in my alarm code. 3 days later, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, Richard Vance called my cell phone. His voice was entirely different from our first meeting. It was sharp, deliberate, and gravely serious. He asked me to come to his office immediately, saying he had just retrieved the certified probate records from the county court regarding my late grandfather Arthur's estate. When I arrived at Richard's office, he had 3 thick, yellowing legal files spread across his desk, alongside financial statements from a bank that had ceased operations 10 years prior. He asked me to sit down and take a deep breath. What he was about to tell me completely shattered every memory, every belief, and every shred of respect I had ever held for my parents. Grandpa Arthur hadn't died penniless, nor had he left behind just a small amount of cash for funeral expenses. Grandpa Arthur was a retired machinist who had quietly invested in local commercial real estate throughout his lifetime. When he passed away 11 years ago, his estate was valued at just over $950,000. According to the explicit terms of Grandpa Arthur's legally binding last will and testament, his estate was to be divided into 3 distinct equal parts. 1/3 was to go to my mother Susan, and the remaining 2/3 were to be held in 2 separate irrevocable testamentary trusts, one for me and one for my sister Chloe. The trusts were specifically designated to fund our higher education, our first home purchases, and our early adult establishment. Under the terms written by my grandfather, each trust was initialized with roughly $316,000. The terms stipulated that my mother and father were appointed as the temporary co-trustees of those funds until Chloe and I turned 25 years old, at which point the full remaining principal and accrued interest were to be turned over to us directly. I sat in that leather chair, feeling the air completely leave my lungs. My mind was racing, trying to connect the dots. I had turned 25 2 years ago. I had never received a single dime from a trust. I had worked 2 jobs during college, taken out $20,000 in federal student loans, and scraped together every penny for the down payment on my fixer-upper through grueling 60-hour work weeks. I looked up at Richard, my voice barely a whisper, and asked him where the money went. Richard flipped to the final page of the probate accounting audit, pointing his finger at a series of signatures and bank transfer logs executed between 7 and 10 years ago. Richard explained that my parents, acting as co-trustees, had systematically looted both trusts. Shortly after Grandpa Arthur passed away, my father had suffered major losses in a failed commercial printing business venture. Instead of taking accountability or declaring bankruptcy, my parents had illegally transferred funds out of my trust and Chloe's trust to cover my father's business debts, pay off their own personal mortgage, and fund an extraordinarily lavish lifestyle that included luxury vacations, high-end vehicles, and private school tuition for Chloe. They had completely drained my trust down to zero by the time I entered my sophomore year at Ohio State. The $80,000 they claimed they generously paid toward my college tuition wasn't their money at all. It was a tiny fraction of my own inheritance that they hadn't managed to blow on their own bad decisions. And to cover up their crime, they had created the elaborate narrative that they had paid for my college out of their hard-earned savings, expecting me to feel eternally indebted to them. Even worse, Richard discovered that my parents had treated Chloe's trust differently. When Chloe turned 21, my parents had used the remaining residual assets from her trust to pay off her entire Chicago apartment lease and fund her lifestyle, while completely lying to me about my share ever existing. They had manipulated the entire family dynamic to ensure I felt obligated to support them, effectively using me as a financial shield to prevent their fraud from ever coming to light. Richard looked at me with deep sympathy and said, "Julian, what your parents did isn't just a civil violation of fiduciary duty. This is grand larceny, embezzlement, and systematic trust fraud. They stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from you when you were a minor and a young adult. If we present this evidence to the county prosecutor, your parents are looking at serious felony charges and mandatory state prison time." I sat in the silence of that office for what felt like an eternity. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was paralyzing. The people who had brought me into the world, who had sat across the dinner table from me 2 weeks ago presenting me with a fake bill for my own life, had spent a decade hiding the fact that they had stolen my actual life savings. The black binder, the spreadsheet, the harassment at my workplace, the public shaming. It was all an aggressive, desperate defense mechanism designed to force me into paying them back before I ever grew smart enough to look into Grandpa Arthur's past. Richard asked me what I wanted to do. He told me we had 2 distinct paths. We could immediately file a civil lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty and conversion, combined with a criminal referral to the State Attorney General's Financial Crimes Unit, or we could attempt a formal legal settlement through counsel. I told Richard I needed 24 hours to process everything. I drove back to my empty house, sat on the floor of my living room amidst the unpacked boxes and the broken ceramic pieces of the lamp my sister had smashed, and I made my decision. The time for protection, patience, and family loyalty was completely over. The following afternoon, I had Richard prepare a formal, legally binding summons and demand letter. We scheduled a mandatory meeting at Richard's law office for the following Tuesday morning. Richard sent a formal process server to my parents' house in Canton, delivering the notice directly to my father's hands. The notice stated clearly that David and Susan were required to attend a legal conference regarding the administration of the Arthur Miller Testamentary Trust, and that failure to attend would result in immediate criminal referral to the county prosecutor. On Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock, my parents walked into the conference room at Richard's firm. They were accompanied by Chloe, who looked angry and combative. My father entered the room with his chest puffed out, clearly believing this was some legal maneuver I was pulling to try and negotiate down the $3,200 monthly payment. He dropped his signature black binder on the mahogany table, looked at Richard and snapped, "We don't need a high-priced lawyer to tell us our rights. Julian owes us for his upbringing, and we aren't leaving this room without a signed agreement for his monthly contributions." Richard didn't say a word. He calmly pushed 3 thick, red-labeled binders across the table. One for my dad, one for my mom, and one for Chloe. Inside were certified copies of Grandpa Arthur's original will, the probate court orders establishing the trust, and 24 pages of line-by-line bank forensic audit reports showing every illegal transfer my parents had executed from my trust account into their personal checking accounts over a 7-year period. My dad picked up the top paper, his eyes scanning the header. Within 5 seconds, the color completely drained from his face. His jaw went slack, and his hands began to tremble so violently that the paper rattled against the wooden table. My mother leaned over to look, her smug, serene expression instantly shattering into a look of absolute, unadulterated terror. Richard cleared his throat and spoke in a calm, icy tone that filled the room. "Mr. and Mrs., my client has discovered the full extent of your actions as co-trustees of the Arthur Miller estate. You breached your fiduciary duties, illegally converted over $316,000 of your son's direct inheritance, and used fraud to conceal these actions for over a decade. Furthermore, you have engaged in systematic harassment and extortion tactics against my client to cover your financial defaults on an unauthorized hard money loan for a property in South Carolina." My mother burst into tears, dropping her head into her hands, while my father stammered, looking frantically between me and Richard. He tried to speak, his voice cracking, claiming that things were difficult back then, that his business was failing, that they did it to keep a roof over our heads, and that they always intended to pay it back. I looked at my father from across the table, speaking for the first time since they had entered the room. My voice was steady, completely devoid of the anger or hurt I had felt days prior. I told him, "You didn't use that money to keep a roof over our heads, Dad. You used it to pay off your bad debts, buy luxury cars, and take vacations to Cancun while telling me I had to work night shifts at a warehouse to pay for my own textbooks. You sat in your house 2 weeks ago and told me I owed you $342,000 for raising me, when the truth is, you stole $316,000 from me before I was even old enough to understand what a bank account was." Chloe sat frozen, looking back and forth between our parents and the documents, completely stunned. She had known our parents favored her, but she had never realized the entire family's financial existence was built on an illegal theft from her brother. Richard slid a final legal document across the table. It was a formal settlement and restitution agreement, combined with a strict mutual non-disparagement and no-contact contract. Richard outlined the terms in brutal detail. First, my parents were required to immediately list their primary suburban home in Canton for sale, with all net equity proceeds, estimated at roughly $210,000, to be placed directly into an escrow account held for my full restitution. Second, they were required to execute an immediate forfeiture of their down payment on the Hilton Head condo and sell off 2 of their personal vehicles to make up the remaining balance of the stolen inheritance, plus interest. Third, they were required to sign a complete, unconditional waiver of any and all present or future claims regarding parental support or filial responsibility. Richard looked my father dead in the eye and delivered the ultimatum. "You will sign these agreements today, and you will liquidate your assets to repay Julian every single dollar you stole, plus legal fees. If you refuse, or if you attempt to delay by even 24 hours, my next call is directly to the white-collar crime unit of the State Attorney General's office. You will be indicted for grand theft and fraud, and given your ages and the dollar amount involved, you will serve substantial time in state prison." My dad looked at the document, then at my mother, who was sobbing uncontrollably, begging him to sign it so they wouldn't go to jail. My father's swagger, his arrogance, his righteous indignation, all of it was completely gone. He was just a defeated, broken man sitting in a suit he couldn't afford, staring down the barrel of his own criminal greed. With a shaking hand, my father took the pen from Richard and signed every single line of the legal agreement. My mother signed right after him, her tears smudging the blue ink on the signature pages. Over the next 4 months, the terms of the settlement were executed with surgical precision. My parents were forced to put their house on the market at a reduced price for a fast cash sale. The equity, along with the proceeds from selling their late-model cars, was wire transferred directly into my bank account, yielding a total recovery of $288,000 after real estate fees and Richard's legal expenses. My parents were left with practically nothing. They were forced to move out of our family home and rent a tiny, single-bedroom basement apartment on the outer edge of town. My father had to delay his retirement indefinitely, taking an entry-level inventory job at a local auto parts distributor at 62 years old just to pay their basic rent and utility bills. The Hilton Head retirement dream was completely dead. Chloe, humiliated by the exposure of our parents' crimes and realizing there was no longer a financial pipeline for her to exploit, moved back to Chicago and stopped communicating with all of us. As for the extended family, the uncles, aunts, and relatives who had spent weeks harassing me on my parents' behalf, Richard sent a copy of the court-filed civil settlement summary to every single one of them. The silence that followed was absolute. My Uncle Mark never called me again. No one asked me for money, no one accused me of being ungrateful, and the toxic narrative my parents had spun completely collapsed under the weight of certified legal facts. I used the recovered funds to pay off the remaining principal on my house in Canton, clearing my mortgage completely at 27 years old. I invested the remaining balance into low-risk index funds, securing a real financial foundation for my own future, the foundation my grandfather had intended for me all along. Looking back on that Sunday dinner, I realized that my parents' demand for $3,200 a month was never really about retirement. It was the final desperate act of two people who knew their decade-long crime was nearing its expiration date, trying to force their victim to pay for his own theft. I haven't spoken to my mother or father since the day they signed those papers in Richard's office, and I never will again. They spent my entire life trying to convince me that I owed them everything. But in the end, the ledger was balanced, the truth was exposed, and I finally got my life back.